Breaking news tonight as 8 major NATO allies have issued an unprecedented joint statement within the past 24 hours directly challenging the Trump administration's escalating threats over Greenland. And the language they've chosen represents the most explicit rebuke of American foreign policy by our closest democratic partners in modern memory. The leaders of Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom have declared their full solidarity with Denmark and Greenland, while condemning tariff threats as actions that, quote, undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. This coordinated response comes as military forces from Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway have deployed to Greenland for a 2-day exercise that European officials are framing as a defense of Arctic security, but that unmistakably signals a willingness to stand firm against American reshore. And here's what makes this moment so consequential. New polling data released today shows that only 17% of Americans support acquiring Greenland, with a mere 4% backing the use of force, meaning the Trump administration is pursuing what may be the most unpopular foreign policy initiative in recent American history, while Republican lawmakers twist themselves into increasingly absurd rhetorical knots, trying to justify actions that contradict both public opinion and basic strategic logic. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what this joint statement means for the NATO alliance and why it represents a watershed moment in transatlantic relations. Reveal how Republican senators are fabricating national security justifications that European defense officials are publicly contradicting. Explain the real-world economic consequences already materializing as allies begin redirecting trade relationships away from the United States, and show you why foreign policy experts believe this Greenland crisis is accelerating the very geopolitical outcomes the administration claims it wants to prevent. Let's begin with the joint statement itself, because the specific language matters enormously and reveals just how seriously our allies are taking this threat. The statement was released simultaneously by the governments of 8 NATO members, a level of coordination that doesn't happen casually or quickly. These kinds of joint declarations require extensive diplomatic negotiation, agreement on precise wording, and political will from multiple heads of state or government to publicly challenge the United States. The fact that it happened at all tells you how alarmed European capitals are about the current trajectory. The statement opens by affirming the signatories' commitment as NATO members to strengthening Arctic security as a shared transatlantic interest. That framing is deliberate. They're positioning Arctic defense not as a unilateral American concern, but as a collective alliance responsibility, which directly undercuts any argument that the United States needs to act alone or acquire territory to address security challenges in the region. The statement then addresses the military exercise currently underway in Greenland, describing it as a pre-coordinated Danish exercise called Arctic Endurance, conducted with allies in response to security necessities. And here's the key phrase: it poses no threat to anyone. That's a direct response to suggestions from Trump and Republican officials that European military activities in Greenland represent some kind of provocation or indicate that Denmark can't manage security in its own territory. The European position is clear. We're conducting legitimate defensive exercises, we coordinated them in advance, and they threaten no one, which implicitly includes the United States. Then comes the most significant language in the entire statement, quote, "We stand in full solidarity with the Kingdom of Denmark and the people of Greenland." That is unambiguous alliance solidarity against American pressure. These 8 countries are collectively telling the United States that if you're pressuring Denmark, you're pressuring all of us, and we will stand together. The statement continues, building on the process begun last week, we stand ready to engage in dialogue based on the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that we stand firmly behind. Translation: we'll talk, but only if the conversation respects that Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland and Greenland's right to self-determination are non-negotiable. There will be no negotiations about transferring Greenland to the United States, because that violates principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that form the foundation of the rules-based international order these nations committed to upholding after World War II. And then, the statement delivers its most direct criticism. Tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. Let's pause on that language. Our NATO allies are publicly stating that American economic coercion threatens the entire transatlantic relationship and could trigger escalating retaliation that damages everyone. They're not sugarcoating it. They're not using careful diplomatic euphemisms. They're saying this is dangerous and destructive. The statement closes with a commitment to continued unity and coordination in response, and a declaration that they are committed to upholding their sovereignty. That final phrase is crucial. European nations are asserting that American pressure on one member state to surrender territory is a sovereignty issue for all of them, and they will defend that principle collectively. This is not business as usual diplomatic pushback. This is 8 major democracies, all NATO allies, some of America's closest partners for 75 years, drawing a line and saying we will not accommodate this pressure and we will coordinate our response to resist it. Now, the military exercise in Greenland that prompted part of this statement deserves closer examination because it's being wildly mischaracterized by Trump administration officials and Republican lawmakers. Video footage has emerged showing troops from Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway arriving in Greenland for what Denmark has described as a routine 2-day Arctic defense exercise. These exercises have been conducted periodically for years as part of NATO's overall Arctic strategy. They involve training for cold weather operations, coordination between allied forces, and demonstration of defensive capabilities in a strategically important region. There is nothing unprecedented or threatening about them. But Republican senators, clearly scrambling to justify Trump's Greenland obsession, have begun spinning a completely fabricated narrative about why these exercises are supposedly necessary and how they somehow vindicate the administration's approach. Senator Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma provided perhaps the most egregious example in a recent interview when he claimed that these European deployments are a message to China and Russia in response to continuous exercises those countries have been running just off Greenland's coastline, which he described as a true national security threat to NATO. He went on to argue that NATO has been saying for 20 years that Denmark needed to do something about these Chinese and Russian exercises, and that if the United States is going to invest billions in Greenland's defense, it should be American soil. Every single element of that explanation is either false or misleading. The chairman of the Danish Defense Committee responded directly to Mullen's claims on social media, writing, "Chairman of Danish Defense Committee here. Please tell me more about these Chinese and Russian military exercises near Greenland. We haven't heard about that." That's a devastating and public contradiction from a senior Danish defense official, essentially calling an American senator either a liar or so misinformed about basic security facts that he shouldn't be commenting on the issue. There are no continuous Chinese and Russian military exercises just off Greenland's coastline. There is no 20-year NATO consensus that Denmark has failed to manage Greenland security. These are fabrications designed to create a false justification for American territorial ambitions. But Mullen wasn't alone in this deceptive framing. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas also weighed in, claiming he wants to commend President Trump for being single-mindedly focused on America first and U.S. national security interests. Cruz argued that acquiring Greenland is overwhelmingly in America's national interest, pointing to rare earth minerals and Greenland's Arctic location as critical for potential military conflict with Russia or China and for missile defense through systems like the ground-based Midcourse Defense Program. Cruz then invoked historical precedents, noting that American territorial expansion through purchases like the Louisiana Purchase and Alaska has been central to the nation's history, suggesting that Greenland should be viewed through the same lens. Let's dismantle this argument piece by piece because it reveals either profound ignorance or willful dishonesty about how American security interests in the Arctic are currently being served. First, the rare earth minerals argument. Yes, Greenland has significant mineral deposits, but the United States doesn't need to own Greenland to access those resources. American and international mining companies can and do negotiate development agreements with Greenland's government. Ownership is not required required for resource access. And in fact, the political and economic costs of attempting to acquire Greenland would far exceed any benefit from direct control of mineral rights that could be obtained through normal commercial relationships. Second, the national security and missile defense argument. The United States already has exactly what Cruz claims we need in Greenland. Thule Air Base, located in northwest Greenland, has been operated by the U.S. Air Force since 1951 under agreements with Denmark and Greenland. That base hosts critical early warning radar systems, satellite tracking capabilities, and is an integral part of America's ballistic missile defense architecture. We have access, we have facilities, we have operational capability, all through cooperative agreements with a willing ally. Acquiring Greenland wouldn't enhance those capabilities. It would, however, destroy the cooperative relationship that currently makes them possible and create massive resentment among the Greenlandic population, whose consent and cooperation are actually necessary for continued operations. Third, the comparison to the Louisiana Purchase and Alaska is historically illiterate. Those acquisitions occurred in radically different geopolitical contexts, involved territories that were not self-governing, and in Alaska's case specifically involved a seller, Russia, that actually had the authority to transfer the territory and a local population that had no say in the matter. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark with its own government and the legal right under Danish law to pursue independence if its population chooses. The Greenlandic government has stated unequivocally and repeatedly that Greenland is not for sale and its future is for Greenlandic people to determine. Denmark cannot sell what it doesn't own in that sense, and any change to Greenland's status requires Greenlandic consent, which has not been given and will not be given for incorporation into the United States. So, when Cruz and Mullen construct these elaborate justifications, they're building on false premises and nonsensical comparisons. But here's what's most revealing about their arguments. They're trying to claim that American actions are necessary to counter Chinese and Russian threats in the Arctic. But the reality is precisely the opposite. Greenland is currently protected by its status as part of the Kingdom of Denmark, which is a NATO member. That means any attack on Greenland triggers Article 5 collective defense obligations for the entire alliance. China and Russia are not attempting to take over Greenland precisely because doing so would mean war with NATO, including the United States. It's the alliance structure that deters aggression. By demanding that the United States acquire Greenland, by threatening economic coercion against Denmark, and by undermining Allied unity, the Trump administration is weakening the very deterrent framework that currently protects Greenland and Arctic security. If NATO fractures over this issue, if European allies conclude they can't rely on the United States to respect sovereignty and alliance commitments, then the incentive structure that prevents Chinese or Russian adventurism begins to break down. Trump is creating the exact problem he claims to be solving, and America's adversaries understand this perfectly. Russia and China are not alarmed by Trump's Greenland threats. They're delighted. Chinese state media has been running extensive coverage highlighting how American unilateralism is alienating U.S. allies and demonstrating the unreliability of American partnerships. Russian officials have been notably quiet, which itself speaks volumes. Why object when your primary geopolitical adversary is doing your work for you, fracturing the Western alliance and creating openings for alternative partnerships? The joint statement from 8 NATO allies today is a direct consequence of that dynamic. European leaders have concluded that they cannot simply issue mild diplomatic protests and hope Trump backs down. They need to demonstrate collective resolve and make clear that there are consequences for continued American pressure. And those consequences are already beginning to materialize in ways that will directly harm American economic interests. Consider what happened just days ago as a direct result of Trump's ongoing confrontation with Canada over tariffs. Canada announced it is opening its automotive market to Chinese electric vehicles at the most favored nation tariff rate of 6.1%, allowing up to 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market. Canadian officials framed this as necessary to build competitive EV sector capabilities and bring down costs for Canadian consumers. But the strategic message is unmistakable. If the United States is going to treat Canada as an adversary, Canada will cultivate alternative trade relationships, including with China, even though that creates complications for integrated North American supply chains and makes it harder for American EV manufacturers to compete in the Canadian market. That is one item in one sector from one country. Now multiply that dynamic across the European Union, which collectively represents America's largest trading partner. The EU has massive spending power. European consumers purchase enormous quantities of American goods. European companies invest heavily in the United States. And European governments can absolutely impose economic costs on the United States if they conclude it's necessary to defend their sovereignty and interests. The joint statement today includes explicit language about standing united and coordinated in response. That's not just rhetoric. It's a warning that retaliatory measures are being prepared and will be implemented if American threats continue. What might those measures look like? Tariffs on American agricultural exports targeting politically sensitive products from swing states. Restrictions on American tech companies operating in European markets. Delays or denials of regulatory approvals for American firms, reduced cooperation on intelligence sharing or defense procurement, redirection of European investment away from the United States toward other markets. Each of those actions would have real economic consequences for American workers, farmers, and businesses, and the damage wouldn't be limited to direct trade impacts. When allies conclude that the United States is an unreliable partner that might turn on them for arbitrary reasons, they begin building resilience and reducing dependence. That means diversifying supply chains away from American sources, developing alternative technology platforms that don't rely on U.S. companies, and strengthening relationships with other partners who might serve as counterweights to American pressure. Over time, that restructuring would fundamentally diminish American economic leverage and influence. We would become less central to global trade networks, less essential to allied security frameworks, and less able to shape international outcomes in our favor. That long-term erosion of American power is already beginning, and it's a direct result of foreign policy conducted through threats and coercion rather than partnership and mutual interest. Now let's address the polling data released today because it reveals a stunning disconnect between what the Trump administration is pursuing and what the American public actually supports. A Reuters Ipsos poll found that only 17% of Americans approve of acquiring Greenland. Think about that number. In a polarized country where almost any policy proposal can count on support from at least 30 or 40% of the population just based on partisan identification, this initiative can barely crack 15% approval, and it gets worse. Only 4% of Americans support acquiring Greenland by force. 4%. That's not a policy position. That's a rounding error. It's statistically indistinguishable from the percentage of Americans who believe essentially anything, no matter how absurd. This is shaping up to be potentially the most unpopular foreign policy initiative in modern American history. The Iraq War at its lowest point still had more support than this. So why is the administration pursuing it? The only explanations are that Trump personally fixated on the idea and refuses to let it go, despite all evidence that it's politically toxic and strategically counterproductive, or that there's a belief within the administration that aggressive nationalist posturing plays well with a core base regardless of broader public opinion. Either way, it's policy driven by ego and performance rather than national interest. And Republican lawmakers are trapped. They can't afford to openly break with Trump on a high-profile issue without risking primary challenges and the wrath of the base. But they also can't credibly defend the indefensible, which is why we're seeing these increasingly absurd attempts to fabricate security justifications that European officials are publicly debunking. It would be comical if the stakes weren't so serious. We are watching elected officials lie about Chinese and Russian threats that don't exist, invoke historical precedents that don't apply, and claim security benefits that we already have through existing agreements, all to justify an imperial land grab that the American people don't support, our allies are united in opposing, and that weakens rather than strengthens our actual strategic position. The disconnect between this performance and reality is staggering, and it's having real consequences for how America is perceived and how other nations are responding to us. Let me bring this to the human level, because foreign policy isn't just about governments and militaries, it's about real people whose lives are affected by these decisions. There are approximately 57,000 people living in Greenland, the vast majority of whom are indigenous Inuit. They have their own language, culture, government, and identity. They are not Danish colonists or American expatriates. They are Greenlanders with deep historical roots in that land going back thousands of years. When the Trump administration talks about acquiring Greenland, when Republican senators pontificate about America's national interest in ownership, they're talking about incorporating a population that has given absolutely no indication they want to become Americans. The Premier of Greenland has stated explicitly, Greenland is not for sale. We are not Danish, we are Greenlandic, and our future is for us to decide. That should be the end of the conversation in any world where we take seriously the principle of self-determination that the United States claims to champion. But instead, we have an American president saying, we are going to do something on Greenland whether they like it or not, and threatening economic punishment for Denmark until negotiations occur that Denmark has no legal authority to conduct without Greenlandic consent. Put yourself in the position of a Greenlandic citizen watching this unfold. A foreign power, even one that's historically been an ally, is threatening your government, demanding negotiations about your homeland's future, and explicitly stating it will act whether you like it or not. That's not liberation. That's not partnership. That's colonial rhetoric in the 21st century. And it's being delivered by a country that lectures the world about freedom and democracy. The moral bankruptcy is breathtaking, and it has not gone unnoticed by populations around the world who are watching how the United States treats smaller nations and drawing conclusions about American respect for sovereignty and international law. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this crisis is far from over and the trajectory is deeply concerning. In the near term, the 8 NATO allies who issued today's joint statement are clearly coordinating their response strategy. We should expect to see continued military exercises in Greenland designed to demonstrate that European powers are capable of contributing to Arctic defense without American territorial control. We should expect to see European leaders making high-profile visits to Greenland and Denmark to show solidarity, and we should expect to see the beginning of economic countermeasures if Trump actually implements the threatened tariffs. The European Union is not going to simply absorb a 10% tariff without response. They will retaliate in ways calculated to create maximum political pain for the administration, targeting exports from Republican-controlled states and districts. American farmers, manufacturers, and exporters will find themselves shut out of European markets or facing retaliatory duties that make their products uncompetitive. Those workers and business owners will start pressuring their representatives, and at some point, the political cost of this adventure may finally outweigh Trump's personal obsession. But there's also a darker possibility. If the administration concludes that diplomatic and economic pressure isn't working, if Trump becomes more entrenched rather than backing down, we could see escalation toward actual military posturing or threats. That would be catastrophic for the NATO alliance, and could trigger the kind of crisis that takes decades to repair. European allies would face an impossible choice: submit to American coercion and effectively acknowledge that sovereignty is conditional and can be overridden by more powerful alliance members, or stand firm and risk a fundamental break with the United States that would reshape global security architecture. Neither option is acceptable, which is why preventing escalation to that point is so critical. Congress has a role to play here. Republican lawmakers could, if they chose, make clear to the administration that there is no political support for this initiative and that pursuing it further will damage the party's electoral prospects. They could hold hearings examining the legal and constitutional authority for the actions being threatened. They could pass resolutions reaffirming American commitment to NATO and respect for Allied sovereignty. But that would require courage and a willingness to prioritize national interest over personal political survival. And based on what we've seen from senators like Mullen and Cruz, that courage is in desperately short supply. Instead, we're likely to see continued enablement, more elaborate justifications, and more damage to American credibility and alliances. The international response will intensify. More countries will join in condemning American actions. Trade relationships will be restructured, defense cooperation will be reconsidered, and the United States will find itself increasingly isolated, not because the world turned against us, but because we turned against the principles and partnerships that made American leadership possible in the first place. Here's the bottom line, and it's something every American needs to understand regardless of political affiliation. The joint statement from 8 NATO allies today is not just about Greenland. It's a referendum on whether the United States remains a reliable partner that operates within agreed rules and respects the sovereignty of democratic allies, or whether American power will be exercised unilaterally according to the whims of whoever occupies the White House, with alliances treated as transactional arrangements that can be weaponized whenever they don't serve immediate presidential preferences. Our allies have delivered their answer to that question. If the United States chooses the latter path, they will resist collectively, coordinate their responses, and build alternative frameworks that reduce their vulnerability to American pressure. That restructuring has already begun. Canada is opening its market to Chinese EVs. European nations are coordinating defense policies independent of American preferences. Trade relationships are being diversified. Investment decisions are shifting, and all of this is happening because the Trump administration decided that threatening to seize an ally's territory was somehow in America's national interest. Despite overwhelming public opposition, complete absence of legal or moral justification, and catastrophic damage to the relationships that have underpinned American security and prosperity for 3/4 of a century. The Greenland crisis is not an aberration. It's a symptom of foreign policy untethered from strategy, unconstrained by law, and unaccountable to the public. And the consequences will define American power and influence for a generation. As this situation continues to develop, I'll be tracking every statement from allied governments, every economic countermeasure, every shift in the geopolitical landscape that this crisis accelerates. This is not a side story. This is the unraveling of the post-World War II order in real time, and Americans deserve to understand what's being lost and why. If you want to stay informed with serious analysis that goes beyond the headlines and helps you understand the real stakes in these developments, subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you don't miss critical updates. Share this report with anyone who needs to understand why our allies are pushing back and what it means when only 17% of Americans support a policy their president is pursuing over unanimous allied objection. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe the Trump administration will eventually back down when the economic costs become clear, or will this escalate into a full crisis that permanently damages the NATO alliance? Your perspective matters, and this conversation is too important to leave to politicians who seem more interested in defending the indefensible than protecting American interests. We'll continue this coverage as events unfold. Thank you for watching.